Oh my gosh, of course, cough right in the beginning. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, either direction. Really glad you guys could all join us this week. It is Thursday. It's September 19th. It's 1 p.m. Eastern time. And we've got a short and sweet one for you today to get caught on some of the freight shifts happening, but really a hot take on what's going on with these negotiations. Because quite frankly, they are very, very unique. But first and foremost, if this is your first time joining us, welcome. It's our weekly ship show. Every Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern time, we are live. Every other week, we do a freight market roundup. The weeks in between, we cover very specific topics. And quite frankly, I'm going to say this a few times, but the weeks leading up to this strike, I'm just going to say it like how it likely is strike, we're going to be really focused on what's happening on the East and Gulf Coast ports. So next week, Freight Market Roundup, we go through all the ocean rates of major shipping lanes, what our customers are paying with us that week. Then we also discuss what's happening in the air area. Should have worded that slightly differently. But on top of that, we like to touch on the topics that our customers are asking us about or the topics that our teams are thinking about or planning around. So we just kind of try to take what we're doing internally, bring it out so you can kind of have a view of under the hood of SCS. And they're really fun episodes. A lot of people message us about them, say, hey, thanks for that one. Hey, could you add this in? Which, by the way, please always shoot us recommendations. We love that. But we represent Supply Chain Solutions. I represent Supply Chain Solutions. And what we do is we're really a full service logistics provider. We ship to and from more than 150 countries on a yearly basis. We handle literally every link in the chain. We actually started out as a consulting organization back in 2001. And since then, as our customers' needs increased and they asked us, hey, you've done a great job here, please help us out in this area. If we couldn't find the right solution, we built our own. And we started out with like white label technologies, which had really fantastic successes. But we just built our organization organically. And it's been really fun to kind of watch it grow and develop over the years. So if you don't work with us now, it is a great time. It's a year of reorganization for a lot of companies. So give us a call. We'll kind of run through what you're doing right now. And we'll discuss if you're a good fit, because quite frankly, we've got a footprint. If it lines up with yours, if it lines up with our carrier base, if it lines up with our available capacity right now, you could be a perfect shoe-in. So make sure you reach out to us and we can kind of go through the details, see if it's good. Now, this week, as I just mentioned, we are going to be talking about this ILA strike. But I did the one more thing. Last week, if you joined our Freight Market Roundup, I didn't go over air freight rates. And I said, hey, I'm sorry, I'll start out with them this week. So as promised, let's run through them. Now, specifically, we like to focus on the air shipments that are coming out of Southeast Asia or China and headed into the US. So our customers, as of last week, saw an average cost per kilo of $5.91 across all OD pairs. That's $5.91 per kilo across all origin and destination pairs. Then we saw our low coming in at right around $5.22 when shipping into LAX. Pardon me. And a high coming in at $6.45 a kilo when shipping into JFK. Now, let's get on with the regularly scheduled programming. So let's go back to this negotiation here. And it's very unique because what has been made very clear over this past month in particular, but really over the course of the year, has been this is just an extremely unprecedented contract negotiation. And it's hard to really paint the picture on the significance of that. But what is being demanded by the International Longshoremen's Association, or the ILA, which I'm going to refer to them as the ILA from now on for short, it's really the biggest ask in recent history of the organization. But we've got less than 2 weeks now between now and the contract deadline, and there is not a single talk scheduled between the United States Maritime Alliance, also known as USMX, and the ILA. And if you just go based on all of the rhetoric that's been out there, going to the West Coast, just let's kind of go down a rabbit hole real quick. Going to the West Coast port negotiation, the rhetoric out there was very slim to none. There's a really solid media blackout they do. You get these little kind of tidbits when frustrations kind of arise, but for the most part, you're just sitting there hoping it's moving forward. This has been completely different. Don't get me wrong, there still is a blackout, but the amount of announcements, the amount of just leaks of information, leaks by the organization, it's just night and day differences here. So if you follow that rhetoric that the ILA has had, they said, if we hit that expiration date and there's no negotiation, we strike. And that's that is massive. So I just need to illustrate how significant that is. So maybe you've been in procurement, you've been in logistics, you've been shipping, and you've been managing East Coast imports or exports long enough to remember. But the last major, I'm going to say quote unquote strike, but the really last major situation that happened in the East Coast and Gulf Coast ports happened back in 2012 and 2013. Now, I'm not going to go into the details here, but that labor dispute was very, 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 very close to ending in a strike action. But the key words here is close. Now, what makes this significant is that, and that was the closest it had been to a strike, but right now we are the closest we've been to a strike in nearly 50 years on the East and Gulf Coast ports. There has been work slowdowns, but a full-blown strike, no. So, and here's the crazy thing too. If we go back to the 2012, 2013 contract negotiation, which as a reminder was not the last one, but if we go back, their contract expired on September 30th, and there was no even credible mention of strike until much after that contract expiration. So the whole strike action and the avoidance happened in January of 2013. The contract ended in September of 2012. So very, very fascinating. But yeah, crazy thing here, it's all the way back to 1977 that the East Coast and Gulf Coast ports had their last full-blown strike. And there is a very clear reason for that. And that's really what's been challenged here in this year's contract negotiation. But there has been this simple philosophy, this simple unwritten rule of sorts. And both parties have always kind of known this during these contract negotiations, but they've always tiptoed around full-blown exploiting it. And that's been that the carrier's goal has always been to keep the ports open, no matter what the cost. And pardon me, you notice I say carriers here when I earlier was talking about USMX and ILA, but I'm saying carriers versus port employers because the USMX is made up of both carriers and port employers. So let's go back to that unwritten rule. In the past, this idea of keeping the port open, it's led to major concessions on wages, on benefits, and simply it's because the carrier members, they've always been primarily motivated to avoid disruption on the docks, and they were willing to pay handsomely to achieve that goal. But what has been made very clear through this contract negotiation is that the ILA, and specifically the ILA's president, Harold Daggett, he kind of tasted the forbidden fruit of sorts. And he drew this hard line in the sand right in the very beginning of the talks, which essentially said, we know you're going to submit to our demands, and I'm going to make it clear that we are striking if you don't fulfill them to the letter. And this has been such a wild experiment when you look at all the contract negotiations we've witnessed in the past. And quite frankly, this kind of poking the bear that he did, I'm starting to feel, and the community is starting to feel, that it completely erased that simple philosophy that's always guided the success of these dock worker union negotiations in the past. So why do we feel that way? Why is this kind of topic kind of coming up? Well, because if you look through what happened in the West Coast negotiations, if you look through particularly the 2012, 2013 negotiations, unlike in the past, what we are seeing or feeling is no urgency to get the deal done. So the carriers are simply appearing completely unwilling to make any effort to bridge this divide. And that is such a stark difference from what we saw back in 2012 and 2013. Those contract negotiations, you saw this urgency, this sense of just high alarm among the carriers in particular, that they knew the burden was on them to solve that problem and avoid that strike. So really, what is rather kind of unfortunate about this year and the strategy this year with the ILA, the timing, if you go back and you run through the rhetoric and you kind of see Harold Daggett, they're hearing these quarterly earnings calls, they're understanding where their last contract negotiations went, which many said didn't go far enough. And they're like, you know what, with these unprecedented profits will come unprecedented wage increases. There's a clear line of logic that brought them to this point, even though us who've been following the market very, very closely, you've kind of seen what's been happening week over week. You've seen the volumes and such. We all knew it wasn't that simple. Anyway, the timing of this unprecedented push, unfortunately, couldn't have been worse. And really, that's because the carriers' viewpoints that make up the USMX, they've pretty much been jaded in recent years in their negative experiences in the US market. So it's a pretty long list of why these carriers are not loving the US market right now. But I mean, let's start from the top. Personally getting blamed by the US president and members of Congress for the high rates and the lack of capacity that were experienced by shippers during the pandemic. We can also talk about the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022. We discussed that on the show, and that actually becoming a law despite a lot of pushback from carriers, a lot of objections. And then also we can talk about the Federal Maritime Commission, which morphed from its traditional carrier-friendly body into what a lot of people are calling now kind of a consumer protection agency for shippers. Now, I want a little disclaimer here. We talked about all those topics. we think the Ocean Shipping Reform Act has been very helpful. We also think this switch over with the FMC has been fantastic for shippers. But remember, we're looking at this from the carrier's point of view. So when you consider this changing temperament of the US market and the challenges they've been trying to overcome, and you also have to include just the seesaw demand, which has been very hard for them to manage and let alone make a profit on for quite some time now. It really does start to make sense why the carrier members are less motivated than they've ever been before to take more concessions in order to get a deal signed and keep those ports open. Also, looking again through the eyes of the carriers, it's not only the US terminal costs which include labor costs that are among the highest in the world, but also carriers can't assess a terminal handling charge on shipments to a shipper. So any pay increases for dock workers that carriers agree to is going to come directly out of their pockets for the coming years, which in a reality has been painfully clear to them after the West Coast port negotiations that just wrapped up. Well, not just wrapped up. Now this is the thing about supply chain. You just have to view things in year cycles, and you always have to be looking at the next cycle. Not the only industry that way, but something we're very aware of as well. But anyway, my hot take on this, because it is pretty critical right now that you are very, very focused on what's happening in the ILA and the USMX negotiations. But my hot take is it's going to be a simple left or right. Actually, it's going to be an extreme left or right. We're either going to see a 11th hour deal struck between the ILA and the USMX, and it will have to involve concessions from the ILA, or we're going to see a very painful strike in which the USMX is going to try to reset the tone of these talks completely. And, if you are one of the companies who signed up for some of these bullet rates, which don't get me wrong, we've all seen what's happened to rates over the course of this year so far. I mean, just late spring, just the skyrocketing, particularly of the West Coast rates. And then, obviously, if you were shipping from Southeast Asia or China into the East Coast, very expensive as well. But with this strike coming up, obviously those bullet rates and such, which we discussed last week, have been coming out. If you find yourself on a vessel and you're going to be arriving September 30th or October 1st in particular, it could be challenging. Now, on the flip side, the Port Authority and the ports in general, they're starting to kind of build these contingency plans. They've already announced they're going to consider being open for weekends and later. And so they're going to really try to kind of clear out as much as possible before this strike. But, they really seem to be, if you kind of compare it to what happened in Canada, which was obviously a reverse situation, all the preparations are in order for this strike to occur, and no communications happening at this point. So 100% plan on it. The dilemma here is, given the changes in this negotiation, let's hope for that 11th hour. Let's hope for that 11th hour deal. But it is not looking likely at this point. So that's my hot take. Really appreciate you guys for joining. We've got our regular freight market roundup next week. That is, which I discussed earlier. We cover a lot of things. Make sure you join. We are going to be staying focused on the ILA, though. So a lot of our current events and such are going to be focused around some of the things happening in that realm, if there is things happening in that realm, which let's all hope for. Anyway, thanks so much. Make it a great day.